occasions, most recent April 2015, to work on an agreed action plan with targets and 6 monthly reports to ensure targets were achieved. These targets include legislative and non-legislative interventions. At no time did the FATF targeted review include the 2013 Amendment Bill with APNU's amendments. At the last meeting in April 2015, it was agreed there was need for a slew of regulations to bring the bill in compliance. It is noted that no regulations have been tabled. The public was informed in the local media and on the internet media of Friday, June 19th and Saturday, June 20th, 2015, that the 2015 AML-CFT Amendment Bill will be tabled for first reading at the June 25th sitting. In the said reports, we learned that the Chargé d'Affaires of the United States Embassy, Brian Hunt, expressed his support for the bill that government will be tabling, noting the new government has been very clear that it was a priority to introduce and pass that legislation through Parliament at the earliest time possible. Most surprising of all, it is reported that the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires pointed out the bill was fully compliant with the recommendations made by both the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force and the FATF. It continued in the report to say, if the bill were to be passed, Mr. Hunt is quoted as saying, if the bill were to be passed in its current form, Guyana would then be fully compliant with the recommendations that have been put forward, end quote. As members of the former PSSC and members of the National Oversight Committee regards to anti-money laundering and countering the financing of terrorism, we are very conversant with the FATF recommendations and the targeted review of Guyana, and we are perplexed by the statements by the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires and can only deduce that he is not fully informed or is speaking about the wrong bill. The People's Progressive Party Civic remains committed to ensuring that a FATF-compliant bill is passed. In conclusion, we state that Bill No. 4, 2015 is not in compliance with the FATF recommendations. The PPPC, therefore, has no choice but to oppose Bill No. 4, 2015 and to recommend that FATF be consulted soonest on this said bill. Thank you very much. The floor is open for questions, gentlemen.
Gordon Mosley, News Source. Mr. Sherma, you're pointing out that the party is opposing the new bill that's being presented tomorrow. Don't you think your opposition to the bill will have more weight should you be present in the National Assembly to debate and to raise your objections there?
We have raised all these matters in 2013 and 2014. There is nothing new. The bill No. 4, 2015, is exactly what was discussed in the committee up to May 2014, no? June 2014.
Yeah.
Right? And there's no change in it. So these arguments we have made ad nauseum in the committee, in the public. I remember when we were meeting in the committee that some of you used to wait outside 8, 9 o'clock at night for a comment. So all of this is fully documented and further documented by CFATF's own letters, which I think we had shared earlier with the media and with the committee. So there's nothing new to say. We have said it all and we will continue to say it. The APNU ALC coalition is cognizant that these sections of the bill are objectionable, and yet they have proceeded to do exactly that, to bring it.
Would you then advise them to put the bill on hold until your party makes its way to the National Assembly so it could be fully debated and you can then raise at that level your objections and try to come to a compromise?
The government has a majority in the parliament.
It is not about our views being ventilated in the parliament.
Exactly.
We have done that to the best of our ability in the select committee as well as on the floor of the parliament for over 2 years, and our best efforts were rejected. The business community, as you know, made appeals to the opposition. Religious organizations made appeals. The diplomatic community made appeals.
International
CARICOM, OAS issued statements. The labor movement made appeals. The entire country called for a FATF, CFATF compliant bill. As I said before repeatedly, we are not in this bill legislating at large. We are simply bringing into municipal law international obligations which devolve upon us as a country. And therefore, that is our priority. It matters not what we feel so much. What is of paramount importance is the recommendations which have been given to us to reduce into our legislation and pass in the Parliament. Now, in our statement, we made reference to the importance of monitoring politically exposed persons. This is a category of persons that have specifically been selected and identified by FATF for special treatment in AML-CFT regime and legislation. A manual was prepared by FATF, politically exposed persons. It's a 32-page document in which they outline how politically exposed persons are to be treated. If I may be permitted to read just the first paragraph, because it introduces who these persons are. A politically exposed person, PEP, is defined by the Financial Action Task Force as an individual who is or has been entrusted with a prominent public function. Due to their position and influence, it is recognized that many PEPs are in position that potentially can be abused for the purpose of committing money laundering offenses and related predicate offenses, including corruption and bribery, as well as conducting activity related to terrorist financing. This has been confirmed by analysis and case studies. The potential risks associated with PEPs justify application of additional anti-money laundering, countering the financing of terrorism, preventative measures with respect to business relationship with PEPs. To address these risks, FATF recommendations 12 and 22 require countries to ensure that financial institutions and designated non-financial business and professions implement measures to prevent the misuse of financial systems and non-financial business and professions by PEP, and to detect such potential abuse when it occurs. And this bill, this manual, outlines what role PEP should play and what role they should not play. What they have done in this bill is to take politically exposed persons
MPs.
who are MPs and make them the appointing authority for the FIU. This document basically tells you to insulate them from the investigative and monitoring arm of AML-CFT infrastructure and bodies that are there to investigate. So, and the FIU is central in that process. This bill takes politically exposed persons and make them managers, basically, of the FIU, because this bill allows Parliament to appoint 10 persons and then another 9 who are ex officio members, and they form what is called an AML-CFT authority. And they basically manage the FIU, and it's the Parliament who appoint the FIU director and assistant director. So you have contamination and incest in the FIU infrastructure itself by the role that this bill ascribes to persons who are themselves subject to investigations. As I said, members of Parliament fall into that category. So it is inconceivable how this bill can meet the international requirements in terms of the FIU being an autonomous and independent body and allowed to function in an atmosphere without undue influence of persons who are politically exposed persons. And that is our fundamental difficulty with that provision. I see Mr. Harman saying yesterday how valuable the People's Progressive Party input in the National Assembly. Unfortunately, for 3 years, Mr. Harman was part of a grouping that rejected our every input at the level of the Parliament as well as at the level of Select Committee. So I don't know how this realization has suddenly dawned upon him that our input is important and valuable. They have rejected our input continuously when they enjoyed a majority. And then the other aspect of the bill that I wish to highlight is the one that deals with cash seizures. Now, as the statement emphasizes, our legislative infrastructure suffers no deficiency in that regard. That was not a recommendation. Our law, as currently structured, meets the international requirement in relation to that specific recommendation. So there is absolutely no need for this intervention that is now being introduced to allow this unusual power granted to police officers, customs officers, and officers authorized by the FIU to seize and detain cash
in country.
Throughout the country. Now, the CFATF and FATF, they stipulate what are considered to be minimum standards. And that is what countries would want to implement, because all these requirements really place some undue burden and onus on the country's economy. So most countries satisfy the minimum requirements. Here, this bill goes to the other extreme and imposes stringent, stifling requirements, make them part of our law, which are not required and which are going to result in undue hardship. Even when they appear in certain countries, as the statement alludes to, when you examine the legislation in those countries, it is very specific. It grants a power to impose restrictions against disposal, dispersal, and dissipation of properties that are liable to confiscation under anti-money laundering legislation. So in those countries, the law contemplates that there is almost a conviction, if not a conviction. And then there is assets that are identified that are proximately related to that offense which has been committed and which a court has found to have been committed. And there is a real possibility of disposal of those assets. Then this extraordinary power is granted to seize or to put a hold against the disposal in relation to those narrow set of assets, those that are actually contaminated in money laundering and countering and terrorism offenses. And even in that very restrictive circumstance, the power to detain is one that is only given for a few hours before recourse is granted to go to a court to get an order to to extend that delay. But under this bill, a clear reading of it, the relevant section seems to apply to assets at large. It has, after we raised our amendments, our concerns rather, in the select committee, they added certain things to it. They added a proviso which makes it even more difficult for one to decipher what is the true intention of this section. If you have an opportunity, read clause 37 of the bill, which seeks to introduce a new 37A of the bill. And you will see the top half of that clause almost violently collides with the bottom half of the clause. So one does not clearly even understand what is intended to achieve by this clause. And as I said, it's absolutely unnecessary. Absolutely unnecessary.
Yes, further questions? Yes, go ahead.
Mr. Sherman, maybe you can actually help me understand something a little bit better. If we're essentially taking the executive influence out and replacing it with the legislative influence over the FIU and the guideline, what would be a process to ensure that the FIU would then fall out of both of those compartments and be, I don't really know if it could be like constitutional commission or to kind of get both of the influences away, because you are contesting one set of influence and then the APNU was then and now contesting another set of influence. Does that make sense what I'm trying to ask you?
Well, I don't think, I'm not a lawyer, analyst, but the FIU would not, I believe, fall into a constitutional commission. But I think that the 2009 law, which is what went to Parliament to be amended in 2013, we're still talking about the 2009 act. That's still
yeah.
the only act on the floor which is being amended, is that the FIUs, as outlined in that act, dealt with its independence, its removal from interferences. What has happened in this process and in this bill is that it has been overtaken, as the former Attorney General said, it's an incestual relationship. How it is to be brought out, it has to do, I believe, with whether the APNU-AFC was willing in 2013 and 2014 to listen to anything we were saying, to listen to anything that CFATF and FATF were saying, and whether anything has changed in 2015 June in relation to that. If it is that the government is interested in being compliant with FATF and therefore bringing Guyana out of the targeted review, because the targeted review, as we explained, I think, sometime last year, that once you're put up on the grey list, it's not easy to get off of it. Although you have an agreed agenda and you have this and that, it can take 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. There are countries that have taken 6 years to get out of that grey list. And therefore, the more you give them trouble, the more you show that you're not trying to make efforts to be compliant, the more difficult it becomes. So that the issue for the government is to recognize as this is an international obligation. This is not Guyana and only, this is we are considered a threat to the international financing, banking, and insurance systems globally. We're one of those 50-odd countries that are listed. And I have sat in June 2014 in Paris when other countries that are already grey-listed, and it was reported for each country, yes, they've made some changes here, they've made some changes here, they were making progress here, other countries weren't keeping their targets, and yes, we've noted that, continue. Not one country was taken off the list at that meeting. So we have to recognize that the government has to deal with the reality. It's got to come off some kind of whimsical fancy and believe that Guyana, as this country, can do what it likes. And that was the attitude in the committee. That we have an international obligation, we're considered a global threat, and therefore one has to then comply with what the requirements are. They're fully cognizant this bill is not compliant, and that therefore they have to take action. They will now be attending the America's review group, because Guyana's targeted review continues in that arena, and they will have to go to the meetings and report on what Guyana is doing. And I believe it's maybe that meeting, that whenever the next meeting is, that they may wake up and smell the roses. We have to comply. This is not a debatable issue. So doing what they've done, and in deliberately doing what they've done by bringing these same clauses, is offensive. It's offensive to the FATF and the targeted review. It's offensive to the country here. It is offensive to us in Guyana who want to get this matter off our shoulders. We want to be compliant. We want to be removed from the grey list. The business community wants it. The ordinary people want it. It affects our remittances and a whole range of things. That this is not an issue for the government to pussyfoot on. It must get down to the reality and stop trying to push the ball around and pretend that this is an issue that they can somehow tell the world that they can do what they want and make the FIU director, deputy director, a lawyer, and an accountant for the FIU. This is absurdity. This is banality. Be appointed by the National Assembly and also be removed by National Assembly. Even if one took only that section, those sections, 8 and 9, it is so offensive that I don't see how they could not see what they've done
May I add also
and
that
correct it.
in terms of Guyana complying with its obligations and complying with the duties that has been imposed upon it in the review process, Guyana is considered indivisible, and a change of government does not change our obligations. So while we were in government, we committed to a particular course of action. Our bill has been reviewed both by CFATF, FATF, and then the America Review Group, our version of the bill, and it has been approved. Then in addition to that, as I said on previous occasions, it is an evolving process. So when our bill was approved, Parliament, well, that was when we couldn't get it passed. And then Parliament went into prorogation and then dissolution. Our obligations to comply with other evolving duties did not stop, because the process is not a static and stagnant one, it's an evolving one. So more obligations arose for us to comply with. And we were given the authorization to reduce those recommendations in the form of regulations and to append them to the already assessed and agreed to compliant bill, which is our version of the bill, so that and we undertook that when Parliament commenced sitting, that is the 11th Parliament, because they knew that we were going to an election, we committed Guyana to present to the Parliament that compliant bill, along with the recommendations which were almost completed when I left.
The regulations.
The regulations were almost completed when I left. I heard no mention anywhere about the regulations, and the regulations are very, very, very important. They are as important as the bill, because they captured some more recent obligations which we have to comply with. So the bill going by itself, as offensive as it is, and even if it was a compliant bill, would not satisfy our commitment. It is a bill along with a slew of recommendations, because that bill, many of the things in it are to be given effect to by virtue of the by virtue of regulations. The bill by itself may be sterile and impotent. It's the regulation that gives it the teeth and to make certain things happen. Specifically though, the question that you have asked, you want to know how do we assure the FIU of this autonomy about which we speak, because at one time you're contending that it was under in government, and the other time it was under, they want to put it under the National Assembly. Well, that is something which is recognized. There is no body in the structure of government and structure of a state apparatus that is free from political influence. The judiciary, for example, is perhaps the institution that requires the greatest degree of autonomy and independence. But it's an acceptable norm that it is the head of state that appoints judges. But there is a process preceding the appointment that ensures the independence and autonomy. The FIU structure must achieve that same purpose. It must have certain insulation and mechanism in place that protects the FIU in its functioning. So even if the president makes the appointment, then in the discharge of the functions, the FIU is allowed to operate in an environment that is free from influence. In this case, the FIU is operating under a regulatory body, under the dictates of a regulatory body that are appointed by politicians. And that is where the infection of bias will come. Not only in the appointment process, but the atmosphere in which he has to function. And then when you look at it carefully, the FIU has apart from the authority which is established, that by itself is infected with political bias, he has to operate with a management team that also comes from the parliament. The lawyer and the accountant, to whom references have been made, are appointed by the parliament. So at every level of the FIU structure, it operates in a contaminated environment, not acceptable to international standards. So I believe that answers your
Can I
question.
follow up with this question? You're
Yeah.
saying that the model which government, the former government proposed allows for less inspection than will occur on the National Assembly, because at the end of the day, the executive will still have.
It's only in our bill, the only political action is the appointment of the FIU director by the president. And the truth is, it's better you have contamination coming from one person than contamination coming from 65. Because the parliament has 65 politicians.
But also, I think it's important to note that in the review of the 2009 bill and the required further amendments which were then brought to the House, that at no time did FATF notice or note that that particular section
right.
of the manner in which the FIU director was appointed by the president was ever an issue, and it was no part of the recommendations for amendments to the 2009 bill. So in other words, there was no need to rectify a wrong, because that wasn't a section that came under
that was not
purview.
flagged at
It wasn't
all.
flagged as being in violation. This is where the whims and fancies of the APNA FC come to light.
One other thing, and then I think we
Yeah, and I'll ask Bishop Edgell too if he wants to make a comment as well.
Why not lobby for a compromise then? Why not lobby from an executive appointment and also legislative appointments? Why not work together?
But it's not what we want.
But
We are operating within, all we have to do in this bill is to implement the recommendations, you know.
But that's not the way it's going.
Well, then we are going to be blacklisted.
You
It's
know,
as
I
simple as
want to
that.
advise you, there are only 2 countries in the world that are blacklisted. You know who they are. Do you want Guyana to? I'm asking you a question as press people. Guyana right now is on a grey list with quite a number of other countries, so we're not alone. But there are only 2 countries on the
Pakistan
blacklist.
came off this week, yeah?
Oh, it came off
It
this
came
week, so
off
there's
this
1
week,
left.
yeah.
Do you want Guyana to join that one? Do we really want to? This is what is at stake. You can talk about compromise and whatever. If you don't believe that when we were in government we found certain parts to amend difficult for us, but we realized there's an international obligation. If you don't do it, you're not compliant, you get grey listed and then blacklisted. The impact on your people, your economy, and your international image, particularly with investments and so on, are critical. And so this is not an academic exercise. This is an issue where Guyana has to become compliant. No further debate. And therefore, if the government wishes to insist to go down this road, then we will see what FATF says in September, because we are obligated by September 2015 to bring a compliant, FATF compliant bill into being. Didn't say to bring a bill or any bill, it said to a FATF compliant bill, September 2015. So these are not academic gymnastics we're talking about. This is reality that Guyana has to be compliant according to the FATF recommendations. And instead of focusing on what are the FATF recommendations, we are going into whims and fancies and proving in a very egotistical manner that this is what they wanted in the 2013 Select Committee, 2014. That's what they held up the bill. That's what they made Guyana go before the FATF for targeted review. And now they've gone so far down the line, they cannot retract, because this is what they held us all up for. If they came with a bill that was compliant, which is the sections that we had amended in committee unanimously, and not push this bill, then you could say, yes, they're serious about making sure Guyana has a FATF compliant bill. But what this is about proving a point that they didn't get in committee. They prevented the bill from coming to the House because they had the majority. Now they have the majority. They now bring a bill which they know, with all the inserts that they know are not compliant. The questions are what you have to ask them. What is their real agenda? Is the real agenda about putting Guyana first? Is there a real agenda about bringing a FATF compliant bill? Or is it about trying to, what do you call it, one-upmanship, to show who has the power and who was right in 2014 in the Select Committee and who is right now?
And to justify,
And justify all the delays.
Reasonable position which they took.
To justify the delays that put this country on the brink of being blacklisted. And so I believe firmly that the APNU AFC coalition government is fully cognizant of what is required to be done. And whether we're there or not, they can do it. This bill flies in the face of any such opinion that they desire to bring a compliant FATF bill. Sorry, Bishop, I didn't give you the floor.
There are just a couple of observations I want to make. First of all, the insincerity that exists as it relates to this particular matter. You'd recall that the AFC in particular repeatedly said they had no problems whatsoever with the government's bill. All they wanted was the Public Procurement Commission. And we had received 1,001 reasons publicly from Mr. Ramchatan in particular that the Public Procurement Commission needed to be in place to make sure that this bill receives the necessary teeth. What has happened? We haven't heard anything about the Public Procurement Commission, but we are hearing about this bill. The second observation that I want to make is that the APNU AFC coalition government must prove to the people of Guyana that the added things that they are putting into the bill, that is not a requirement of CFATF or FATF, came as a result of the wishes of the people of Guyana through a process of consultation. The answer to that is no. We have repeatedly made the point, the issue of cash seizures in country. This is a very vexing issue that has very serious implications based upon the fact that Guyana is not yet a credit or plastic-based economy in its operation. We're still cash-based. Every day, people going to buy a car is cash. Going to buy building materials is cash. Businessmen doing transactions and getting supplies to carry up the country areas to the interior is cash. and we're talking here about cash seizures, there has been no consultation on this matter. And if the APNU AFC coalition government is very serious about governing in the interest of the people like they claim to have, or they want to do, there is need for consultation. As it relates to the question that Ms. Balgobin raised, we need to remind that law enforcement is the responsibility of the state, whether it's the Commissioner of Police, whether it's the GRA boss, whether it's the head of CANU or customs that have to, and it's the state that has to answer internationally based upon its obligations. It's never left to another group. It's a state. So there may be, in Mr. Mosley's first question, that is the driving force that the de facto government is seeking to want to have us go to Parliament so that we can propose those amendments to help them to save face. But these were the things that they were prepared to take Guyana through while in opposition. Now that they are in government, they must stand and tell the nation if they are still standing with these proposals, or they are prepared to be man and woman enough to make the necessary amendments to remove the hardships from the people of Guyana. So I don't think the PPPC should be used in the name of democracy and participatory democracy in the parliamentary process to save face for people who were willingly taking us into a dark era. They must be willing enough to determine if they want to continue with this or if they want to make the necessary changes. And finally, it is quite disturbing. And as our statement would have indicated, it's either the U.S. Charge of Affairs have been badly informed or were shown the wrong bill, that we can have an individual, a foreign envoy, pronouncing what will be compliant or not compliant, and he is not a part of the CFATF or FATF machinery. And it would appear that in Guyana, we are prepared to accept whatever pronouncements are made by foreign envoys, because somehow we have been colonized all over again, that whatever masters say is so, as if they are infallible. They are the ones who are infallible. We have a serious issue here in Guyana. And while people can offer comments and suggestions, it is not the U.S. Charge d'Affaires in Guyana that will be determining the compliance or non-compliance of this bill. It's an international agency that is called the FATF, and their regional counterpart, the CFATF. And that is something for us to note, because I can have 6 or 7 experts that are external to the FATF pronounce and declare that something is compliant. But ultimately is when we go to FATF and CFATF, they were the ones that have to declare that. And those and be saying based upon the recommendations that have been made, there's no compliance in that regard. Yes, sir.
We really go off topic if nobody else has a question or a statement.
Yes, you had wanted to ask a question.
Well, I want to go off topic if that's okay.
Beg your pardon?
I want to go off topic if that is okay.
That's
That's a good question. Ms. Teixeira, could you tell us if there has been any determination if you will return as the PPP's whip in the Parliament?
we shall see what we shall see.
She's always the PPP whip.
Even if I'm not officially.
So you will be returning 11 Parliaments as the PPP's whip?
I can't say.
Hasn't been confirmed as
I can't say, but I think you know me enough that even if I weren't the chief whip, I'd still be whooping the other side.
But has a decision been made as yet?
We are still under discussion, Sherry.
Okay.
Next question.
Does the PPP intend to start the setting up of the Public Procurement Commission by not naming its members to
Okay, I'm so glad you asked that question. I'm so glad you asked that question because, you know, you in particular, I always look to, and Pushpa, that you do your research. So let's do some research. Because in order to answer that question, let's go to what is the reality. The Constitution says that the PPC will be appointed by a two-thirds majority of the National Assembly. In the last Parliament, the 10th Parliament, the names come, all 5 names that are passed in the Parliament by a two-thirds majority, come from the Public Accounts Committee. In the 10th Parliament, it's chaired by Mr. Greenwich, it's chaired by the opposition. In this Parliament, whenever we go into Parliament, it's chaired by us. But in the 10th Parliament, you will recall that the PAC advertised in the end of 2013 for nominees, submissions of persons willing to be put forward as members of the PAC. We advertised, I think, before December 2013, and then we advertised again up to February 2014. We had 69 persons that were put before. If you check the PAC agenda, remember the opposition then had 4 members, and we had 3. We were in a minority in all the committees. And so the 69 names were some of them were duplicates, so it came out to 60, I think 64 or 65 names. That matter was on the agenda of the PAC, and the PAC met almost every week throughout until the Parliament, when we stopped meeting in August 2014. And you will notice if you check the agenda for the PAC, that many times that item is asterisk, which means not to be proceeded with. The chairman of the PAC sets the agenda of the PAC. The number of times when it was an asterisk, and we came prepared as the government to start looking at the short listing of the 64 people to come up with 5, it was not proceeded. It was not allowed to be proceeded by the chairman because on those days, they didn't have the quorum. They didn't have all 4 of their people there. They had the chair and maybe 2 others, but not 3 others, because they had to maintain their majority. So if you check, you don't have to believe me, just go and check that the number of times in the minutes of the PAC, in the agenda of the PAC, on the agenda of the PAC, that item has been on the agenda of all of 2014, all of 2013, all of when the committee started in 2012, right? And that to get out of the impasse, and it also paralleled at the same time we're trying to do the money laundering bill. So we said, look, we agreed, let's expedite this issue. Let's go and advertise and so on, because nobody trusts each other. In a previous parliament, it had been that the opposition government would put up names. There was a formula in 2003, 2005 of government put up 3, opposition put up 2. And so we have the 5 and we agree, and nice hands make hands clean, and we go to Parliament, get the 2/3. That was not agreed to by the then opposition. And then again, there were several attempts in the PACs of 2006 to 2011. And then you have then the major change in the Public Accounts Committee in the 10th Parliament, where we actually go and advertise. And of course, some of the names are extraordinarily interesting of who nominated themselves or who were nominated. But nevertheless, it was a list that was doable, and that one should be able to find 5 persons, that there should have been some consensus or possible. This was the closest we came, because we actually had 65 names in front of us. And therefore, the Public Accounts Committee, there seemed to have been, and this is my opinion as a member of the PAC, because it was, there was 4 of us and 5 of them, 9. There seemed to be of little appetite to deal with this issue. Because we said to Greenwich over and over again, why the items on the agenda, let's go forward. And he'd say, no, we defer, or that someone was missing from their side or absent and stuff like that. You don't believe me? Check the records.
Okay, Mr. Sierra, the PB had also said, as government at that time, that they would only support the establishment of the for the Procurement Commission after the opposition party agreed to remove provision from a passed bill or legislation to allow the executive to maintain its no objections to particular contracts.
That's the Procurement Act. The Procurement Act, which was amended, had put a limit on the cabinet, and that had been done when we used to meet at Ocean View as a parliament. I think it was 203, and that the PVP had said. So you're making it sound as if one thing was contingent on the
No,
other.
no, what I'm
I'm saying
saying
very
is
clearly that although the PVP made it very clear that in the discussions on the and in fact there was an amendment proposed which the PVP was willing to consider to the Procurement Act, which was removed from the table by the AFC when we were talking with them about the money laundering bill. So there is a connection between the two issues in the terms of the lobbying and stuff like that, and what you call horse trading. But at the same time, even though that clause there was no agreement to remove that clause from the Procurement Act, the PPP members of the Public Accounts Committee pushed and supported the advertisement to bring people's names in the nominations. It did not in any way, and the record shows, we did not in any way block any effort to look at those 65 names to come up with 5 names. So in other words, you're working at several levels simultaneously. But at no point in the PAC, and there's no record you could find in the PAC, that any PPP member on that committee said that we can't go forward because we're dealing with this amendment on the Procurement Act. That was being dealt with at another level between the two parties, extra-parliamentary. It had nothing to do with the parliamentary action. And so I think you've got to understand that these are not sequential issues. They are issues running simultaneously. And if it was that, in fact, the PNC realized, as we realize, and they will realize it again in this parliament, that the Constitution requires 2/3 majority. So the PAC has to, and that was understanding of Greenwich and everybody, that we had to reach consensus in committee. Because if we didn't reach consensus on the 5 names and took it to the floor, the opposition or the government could vote against it. And so it's the same requirement, and that's why there's a distinction between the PPC and what we're talking about, the money laundering, in that, in the money laundering issues, which former AG was talking about, is that all these issues to do with FIU are simple majorities. Appointment, termination, selection, appointment of the lawyer, appointment, simple majority. So it has nothing to do with, like the Procurement Commission, because it's a constitutional body requiring 2/3, as with all the rights commissions and stuff like that. And why was that? The Constitution insists and wanted to ensure that when these issues came, because they were such powerful bodies with importance to Guyana, that they had support across both sides of the House, at least some support, enough to get 2/3, which is 42 out of 65 seats. Yeah.
Does the party still want that clause removed?
Which clause?
The clause which takes away, that will take away the no objection.
Well, we're rather titillated to see what the opposition, the government will now do.
They said that
They wanted that clause removed.
They wanted it
So
to
I
stay.
assume, Chevy, they will be bringing an amendment to ensure, well, the amendment is there in the Act, actually,
We
so
want cabinet to retain its no objections power.
we always did, and we remain with that
Even as the
principle.
opposition.
We remain in the principle that the state and the government must have some oversight, and this is a no objection issue, Chevy, and therefore the government of the day must be able to have one oversight over the budget it's brought to make sure it's flowing in the right way. It must have oversight. And that is what that clause amendment in 2003 gave, was oversight of the cabinet. To have an objection, not to change a bid from you and I tender, and so I went up to cabinet and then they say, oh, you don't like Gail, give it to Chevy. There was no such thing in the Act. And so it is now I assume the government will hold to their position, which was, and particularly Mr. Kemraj Ramditan, was that there was never going to change that clause that's in the 2003 Act. So we'll see.
So that is the important thing is our views are secondary at this stage. The AFC, APNU have committed themselves to the removal of Cabinet's role in the Procurement Act. And I want to see them hold steadfast to that position.
I couldn't answer that right now because I don't know all the details myself. So I will leave that, ask you to hold that question for when the GS has his Monday meetings.
But as someone who would have
This is, beg your pardon?
It is not been discussed at the
I didn't say it was
executive
not
level.
being discussed. I'm just saying that I am not in a position to comment on it today here. So that is what I'm saying, me. Yes, Gordon.
You have served in government for 2 decades, if my memory is right.
Yes.
How would you advise a government to proceed with a case like this, where you have such serious allegations against a senior politician? How would you advise they proceed with it? If you were in that position, how would you have
The issue has always been, the bottom line has been, one, when the allegations made, to investigate, to assess is there any merit or truth in what is alleged, and then based on one's findings to then act accordingly. And as you know, in many cases, even in the courts, are thrown out on technicalities and so on. So one has to make sure that the investigation and is in accordance with law, rules, protocols that are in place. And so I would expect that the government will do that, although some of their behavior shows that they're not willing to do that. So-
Just to make clear that the police commissioner has noted already that the vehicles have been returned and the former minister was playing a role in helping that to happen. He also said that the file is being sent or is with
Yes.
the director of the prosecution. Now, should any criminal charges or whatever go forward, what can you help me to understand what position the party might be taking, whether they would lend their support or whether they would say, let the law take its course?
Generally, the PPP has always said, let the law take its course.
So you're willing to,
I don't know who you're talking about, my dear. You're being very...
the party
Uh,
on the whole.
I don't know who you're talking about who's being charged for criminally or potentially being charged criminally. And I can't deal with those academics and hypotheses. You are talking about a particular case which appears to be a particular person, which I don't know who that
Could you
person
have
is.
a member of your party?
Yes. And I've said that we will not comment on that. We agree and we've always stood by the implementation and upholding the law. If the Commissioner of Police in his judgment feels a certain way and is of a certain opinion, and the DPP, these matters take their course. The courts determine these issues, if required, if there's evidence, etc. A lot of ifs. And so-
Take its course.
What would you like us to do? I mean, since it seems to be a surprise that the PPP wants to let the law take its course, what would you like us to do? Go to the Commissioner of Police and say, don't you dare do that? What do you want us to do? We have always stood by the law and what the law requires. And if the law is upheld, and it is found that any of the persons or any person has been guilty or has committed an offense, then the law takes its course. And the party will then take its own views on a number of issues as well. Right? Okay. Thank you very much. I mean, you have to remember, Gordon, you are well aware of the number of cases that the government has brought to court
Could you?
for criminal offenses, including bribery, solicitation, all sorts of
You're gonna
things,
get a copy of it.
and including money laundering, and how many cases were thrown out by the courts. Thank you very much, gentlemen and ladies. Good to see you. Beg your pardon? Huh? You'll get
Statements.
copies from